Over the centuries, institutions of power, including the Church, have repeatedly sought to shape public consciousness by controlling information and rewriting history. Sometimes this was to suppress heresies, sometimes to assert dogma, and sometimes to strengthen their own influence and authority. These attempts were global in scope and had a profound impact on how we perceive the past today, distorting or completely erasing entire layers of knowledge and culture. Let us now consider 5 significant aspects that many scholars and historians believe the Church has attempted to, if not completely destroy, then significantly distort, diminish, or consign to oblivion. These efforts have affected not only specific events or individuals, but also vast areas of ideas, scholarship, and even the very existence of cultural traditions that predate Christianity. And the first were the pre-Christian beliefs and cults of Europe. Before the arrival and final establishment of Christianity, Europe was incredibly rich in diverse pagan religions and complex cults, each of which had its own unique pantheons of gods, ramified rituals, calendar holidays that regulated life from harvest to military campaigns, and deeply developed cosmologies that explained the structure of the world and man's place in it. These belief systems did not simply exist as a set of dogmas or a set of superstitions. They were deeply rooted in the daily lives of people, shaping their worldview, ethics, social structures, such as tribal organizations, where priests had enormous influence on decision-making, and even economic activity, determining the cycles of agriculture, hunting, and trade. Take, for example, the Celts, who inhabited large areas of what is now Ireland, Britain, France, Spain, and other parts of Europe. Their beliefs were predominantly animistic and polytheistic, with an animation of nature, with gods and goddesses associated with forests, rivers, mountains, springs, and special places of power, such as sacred groves, druidical sanctuaries, and megalithic structures, dolmens, cromlechs, standing stones. The Druids, their priestly class, were more than just religious leaders. They served as judges, healers, astronomers, philosophers, prophets, and teachers, wielding enormous influence in society, often exceeding that of the chieftains, and serving as guardians of the oral tradition and complex system of laws. The teachings of the Druids, transmitted exclusively by word of mouth and rarely recorded in writing, at least until the Roman conquest, when they began to be written about, but already from the point of view of their enemies, were especially vulnerable to oblivion and destruction after the arrival of a new faith that actively used writing to spread its doctrines and suppress alternatives. Many Druids were brutally killed by the Romans and then by Christians, which led to the disappearance of their knowledge. The Germanic tribes of Scandinavia, Central Europe, and the British Isles worshipped powerful gods, such as Odin, god of wisdom, poetry, and war, patron of kings and heroes, granter of inspiration and victory; Thor, god of thunder and strength, protector of men and farmers, fighting giants; and Freya, goddess of love, fertility, war, and magic, patroness of witchcraft and wealth. Their mythology was full of heroic sagas about battles between gods and men, ideas about Valhalla, the abode of valiant fallen warriors, and a world inhabited by giants, elves, dwarves, and other mythical creatures. These beliefs were closely linked to warrior culture, the fertility of the land, family ties, and the cult of ancestors, permeating every aspect of life from birth to death. Sagas, runic inscriptions, cult objects. All this represented an entire civilization that was declared devilish after baptism. The Romans, in addition to their Olympian gods and elaborate state religion, inherited many cults from the territories they conquered, including mysteries such as the Eleusinian, dedicated to the goddesses Demeter and Persephone, associated with the harvest, fertility, and the afterlife, offering hope for immortality; or the Mithraic, dedicated to the Persian god Mithras, whose cult was especially popular among the soldiers and officials of the Roman Empire, offering strict ethics and brotherhood. These mysteries offered personal salvation, spiritual enlightenment, and a close connection with the deity, often through complex initiation rituals and secret knowledge available only to initiates, making them direct competitors to early Christianity, which also offered personal salvation. As Christianity gained strength, many of these cults' temples were destroyed, their symbols desecrated, and initiates persecuted. The The Slavs in the vast territories of Eastern Europe worshipped such gods as Perun, the god of thunder and lightning, patron of warriors and princes. Oaths were taken in his name. Veles, patron of cattle, wealth and the underworld, god of wisdom and poetry, art. Mokosh, goddess of fertility, femininity, fate and weaving, patroness of women and handicrafts. Their rituals were closely connected with agriculture, the cycles of nature and the worship of ancestors, to whom gifts were brought and memorial rites were performed. Slavic holidays such as Kupala, the summer solstice, a holiday of fire and water, a symbol of purification and fertility. Or Maslenitsa, farewell to winter, symbolizing the rebirth of nature and fertility, burning an effigy of winter, were deeply symbolic and reflected the harmony of man with the surrounding world, his dependence on natural forces and cycles. These holidays were often accompanied by mass festivities, songs, dances, and sacrifices, which were later branded as demonic. However, with the spread of Christianity, beginning with the Roman Empire, where it became the state religion in Dei, under the Emperor Theodosius V, and gradually spreading throughout Europe, a systematic and aggressive campaign to eradicate these beliefs and traditions began. This process was multifaceted and often brutal, encompassing both the physical destruction of objects of worship and a profound cultural reshaping of people's consciousness, aiming to completely change their identity and memory. The construction of churches on the sites of old sanctuaries was not simply a symbolic act of replacement. It was a direct assault on the sacred space of the pagans, designed to assert a new spiritual hegemony and demonstrate the superiority of the Christian God over the previous deities. Many ancient pagan temples, dolmens, sacred groves, altars, and megalithic structures were destroyed, desecrated, or turned into quarries, and their stones were often used to build Christian buildings. For example, Roman temples were rebuilt into churches, pagan temples into monasteries, symbolically grinding the old into the new and affirming the architectural dominant of the new faith. This process was called Christianization of the landscape. Pagan deities were toppled from their pedestals, their images were smashed, for example the idol of Perun in Kiev, and they themselves were transformed into demons, evil spirits, or simply fictitious idols, which made them objects of fear, disgust, and abuse rather than worship. This was a powerful psychological blow to the beliefs of the people, forcing them to renounce their ancestors and their gods under the threat of eternal hellish torment and public censure. Pagan holidays that formed the basis of the calendar cycle and social life, such as Samhain, a Celtic festival of harvest and veneration of the dead, which formed the basis of Halloween, Yule, a Germanic festival of the winter solstice, from which the tradition of the Christmas tree and some Christmas customs such as the Advent wreath originated, or Ostara, the spring equinox associated with fertility and rebirth, a precursor to Easter, were gradually transformed into Christian celebrations such as All Saints' Day, Christmas, or Easter. Their original pagan content was actively erased or reinterpreted in a Christian key, and new dates for celebrations were often imposed on old pagan ones in order to ease the transition of the population and appropriate popular customs, filling them with new meaning, thus undermining their pagan essence. People who continued to practice the old customs were subjected to severe persecution, accused of witchcraft, heresy, and their practices were banned under threat of severe punishment, including death by burning at the stake, especially in the late Middle Ages and early modern periods during the height of the witch hunts. The instruments of this persecution were not only the Inquisition, but also secular courts supported by the Church. Texts describing these beliefs and practices, if they existed in written form at all, most pagan traditions were oral, making them even more vulnerable to destruction since they were easily forgotten without being recorded, were systematically destroyed or ignored as diabolical, pagan, or heretical writings. Monks and missionaries made great efforts to eradicate any reminders of the old gods and customs, so that there would be no alternative to the new doctrine, and so that new generations would grow up in a completely different religious paradigm, knowing no other faith and considering paganism barbaric, primitive and false, that is, prehistoric and backward. The aim was not only to convert the population to the new faith, but also to completely erase the memory of the old gods and customs, to erase them from the collective memory, so that the new faith would be perceived as the only true one, eternal and always existing, sanctified by history and divine origin. This struggle continued for centuries, covering Western, Central and Eastern Europe, sometimes manifesting itself in open violence and bloody crusades against pagans. For example, the crusades against the Baltic peoples, Pomeranians, Prussians, Finns, Saxons, sometimes in a more subtle assimilation and enculturation, when Christianity absorbed and reworked pagan elements, depriving them of their original meaning and making them part of Christian rituals, thus rendering them harmless. Thus, ancient beliefs were not only rejected, but also actively marginalized, demonized, and subsequently forgotten, so that their influence on new generations would be minimal, and history was presented as a linear development from the darkness of paganism to the light of Christianity, where the past of paganism served only as a backdrop for demonstrating the greatness of the new faith and its saving mission. This process was so comprehensive that today we have to piece together information about how our ancestors lived and believed before their world was reshaped by Christianity. By studying archaeological finds, folklore, linguistic roots, and fragmentary references in old, often hostile Christian texts that sometimes inadvertently preserved bits of information about those they were trying to destroy, or who were too well known to be ignored entirely. The second was the Gnostic Gospels and alternative Christian movements. Early Christianity, in its first centuries, was far from being a single monolithic movement, as is often portrayed in traditional history. Instead, it was a complex conglomeration of many movements, schools of thought, communities and interpretations, each with its own unique interpretations of Christ's teachings, its own sacred texts, rituals, and even ideas about the divine nature. It was a time of intense spiritual searching, philosophical debate, heated arguments about the nature of Christ, for example, whether he was fully God, fully man, or a combination of both, and doctrinal formation, when the future of Christianity was not yet predetermined, and a single canon of scripture and basic dogmas were only being formed in the course of fierce conciliar discussions. Gnosticism occupied a prominent place, a complex philosophical and religious system that offered its own, often quite radical and esoteric, view of the nature of God, the world, man, and salvation. Gnostics believed in special secret knowledge, gnosis, that in their opinion was available only to a select few, or to those who had achieved a certain level of spiritual enlightenment through mystical experience and deep intellectual understanding. This knowledge was considered more profound and salvific than simple faith or blind adherence to the rituals and dogmas preached by the emerging Orthodox Church. They often viewed the material world as the creation of a lesser deity, an imperfect and even evil demiurge, a Greek word meaning master or creator, who was often associated with the Old Testament God, rather than the true supreme God, rather than the true all-good and perfect God, who was beyond this world in the so-called pleroma or fullness, and was completely unknowable to the uninitiated, being beyond human perception. This idea contrasted sharply with the Orthodox view of God as the all-good and all-powerful creator of all things, who created the world good and perfect. For the Gnostics, salvation lay not in the atonement of sins through Christ's physical death on the cross and subsequent physical resurrection, but in the attainment of gnosis, which allowed the divine spark trapped within man to escape from the bondage of the material world and return to the true God from whom it originally emanated. They often denied the physical resurrection of Christ, considering it a purely spiritual event, Docetism, and his body an illusion. And their Gospels, which differed significantly from those included in the canon, the traditional Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, include the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in the Nag Hammadi library, containing about 114 sayings of Jesus without narrative context. Logo I, often calling for self-knowledge and inner search, rather than external rituals or the mediation of the Church. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, where Mary appears as a particularly close disciple of Jesus, to whom he revealed secrets inaccessible to the other apostles, and who even entered into philosophical debates with Peter and the other male apostles, showing a deeper spiritual understanding of the teachings of Christ, which challenged the male apostolic hierarchy and the patriarchal structure of the Church. Or the Gospel of Judas, which reinterprets the role of Judas Iscariot not as a traitor, but as an executor of the divine plan, who sacrificed his reputation for the higher purpose of freeing the Spirit of Christ from his bodily shell, since the flesh was considered a prison for the Spirit. These texts offer different, sometimes radical views on the person of Jesus. His teachings, the role of women in the early church, and the path to salvation, significantly different from Orthodox views. While the Orthodox Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which eventually became part of the New Testament, focused on the earthly life, miracles, death, and resurrection of Christ as the central events of salvation, Gnostic texts often emphasized inner spiritual experiences, personal enlightenment, mystical revelations, and the unleashing of the divine spark within each person. They focused less on historical events and more on metaphysical and esoteric matters, making their teachings less accessible to the masses and more attractive to intellectuals and mystics. As the Roman Church grew in strength, consolidated its authority, hierarchy, and sought to unify doctrine and establish a single orthodoxy, Gnostic texts, with their esoteric nature, pluralism, and alternative interpretations, were declared heretical and were to be completely destroyed. Church fathers such as Irenaeus of Lyons, and century author of the extensive work against heresies where he refuted Gnostic teachings in detail, Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria actively wrote extensive treatises condemning Gnosticism, calling it a distortion of true Christianity, a diabolical teaching, and a dangerous heresy capable of leading believers astray from the path of salvation. They sought to discredit the Gnostics and their teachings in the eyes of their flock, presenting them as evil and a fraud that threatened salvation. Entire libraries of Gnostic manuscripts were burned, and their followers were subjected to severe persecution, sometimes leading to their complete disappearance or going deep underground to avoid arrest and execution. In some cases, Gnostics were forced to hide to avoid persecution and preserve their teachings, passing them on secretly from generation to generation, which led to their disappearance from public history for many centuries. Only a few copies survived, hidden in jars or caves and accidentally found centuries later, like the famous Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, discovered by a peasant. This discovery was a real sensation, opening a window into the world of early Christianity, about which almost nothing was known from official sources, and forcing a revision of many established ideas about the history of Christianity and its diversity. This drive for centralization and tight control over doctrine was aimed at creating a single powerful church structure that could effectively govern the flock and present a united front against external persecution by the Roman Empire before the Edict of Milan and internal doctrinal differences, the threat of schisms that could weaken the church. Threats as well as ensuring uniformity of faith, which was considered critical to the salvation of souls and the prevention of heresies that could undermine the authority of the church and its unity. The destruction of Gnostic texts and dissenters was not an accidental act, but part of a deliberate policy to form a canonical set of scriptures. The New Testament, consisting of 27 books, approved by church councils such as Nicaea I and Constantinople I, and to destroy any alternative narratives that could undermine the authority of the emerging church. These texts represented a threat to uniformity and authority, offering people the opportunity to seek truth for themselves rather than relying solely on the church hierarchy, which was unacceptable to the church's quest for absolute power and control over minds. Thus, an entire rich and intellectually sophisticated branch of Christian thought was effectively erased from official history, and it is only through chance archaeological finds that we can now appreciate its scope, depth, and diversity, and understand how complex and heterogeneous early Christianity was before it took its current unified form. Modern research is based on a careful analysis of biblical texts, especially the letters of the Apostle Paul, which, when read carefully, reveal a much more complex picture than is commonly believed, and not just calls for silence. Early Christian documents, such as the Acts of the Apostles, early church rules, letters of the church fathers, lists of martyrs, archaeological finds, evidence from early Christian communities, e.g. tombstones listing women's ecclesiastical positions such as presbyteress or episcopissa in early Christian communities, as well as catacomb frescoes depicting women in clerical roles, as well as discovered non-canonical texts such as some of the Gnostic Gospels indicate that women's roles in the earliest Christian communities were considerably more active, influential, and equal than traditionally portrayed by official church history, which for centuries focused on their secondary and subordinate roles. This traditional view has often been based on later interpretations and exclusions, rather than on the fullness of the early evidence, which paints a much more inclusive picture. There are numerous accounts of women apostles, such as Junia, whom Paul calls prominent among the apostles in his letter to the Romans, indicating her high status and recognition of her missionary work and authority on par with the male apostles. Prophetesses, such as the 4 daughters of Philip mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, who had the gift of prophecy and were active in the ministry, delivering prophecies to the congregation and instructing the believers. Deaconesses, such as Phoebe of Cenchreae, mentioned by Paul as his assistant and a minister of the church, who likely performed important administrative, charitable, and spiritual functions, including baptizing women and assisting in the celebration of the liturgy and the delivery of letters, and house church leaders who played key roles in the spread and development of Christianity. These women were not simply passive listeners or receivers of instructions. They actively preached, taught, sometimes even men like Priscilla, who taught Apollos with her husband, baptized, as evidenced by early catacomb paintings of women being baptized, as well as early church tracts that mention the baptism of women by deaconesses, organized house churches, which were the backbone of early Christianity before the advent of large temples and public assemblies, and where the woman host had considerable authority and leadership, ministered to the poor and the sick, and sometimes even financed missionary work, using their resources to support the apostles and congregations. Her status was significantly higher than that of a mere repentant sinner, as she was later presented in the Western Church tradition, an association that may have been deliberately created by Pope Gregory the Great as a way of downplaying her role and authority, which may have been part of a deliberate effort to downplay her figure and influence in order to avoid elevating her above the male apostles and to reinforce their exclusive authority. The Acts of the Apostles mentions women such as Priscilla, who, along with her husband Aquila, taught Apollos Christian doctrine, indicating her deep knowledge of Scripture and ability to preach and teach, with her name often mentioned first, indicating her leadership role or teaching excellence. Lydia of Thyatira, a purple seller, also became the first European woman to be converted to Christianity by Paul, and her home became the center of the community in Philippi, demonstrating her organizational skills and influence as a patron and leader hosting the apostles and other believers. However, as the church became institutionalized, developed into a powerful hierarchical institution, and developed a strict doctrine that was largely based on the patriarchal principles of the Roman Empire, where women had limited rights and could not hold public office or be a priest, and Jewish traditions, where women also occupied a subordinate position in religious life and could not be equal to men in the synagogue or temple. The role of women began to be systematically belittled and limited. Their preaching and leadership activities were gradually curtailed and then completely banned. Passages in Paul's letters that could be interpreted as calling for the silence of women in the churches. Let your women keep silent in the churches, for it is not permitted to them to speak, but to be in subjection, as the law also says. Let a wife learn in silence with all subjection. But I do not suffer a woman to teach, nor to exercise authority over her husband. But to be in silence came to be emphasized and used as a basis for excluding women from the priesthood and leadership, even though other letters of his, e.g., Rome, where he welcomes many female co-workers, clearly contradicted this statement, demonstrating the active participation of women in ministry and missionary work. Furthermore, many modern biblical scholars believe that these prohibitory passages were either later insertions or related to specific contexts and were not a universal prohibition. At the same time, other texts and testimonies that emphasize their importance were either ignored or interpreted in ways that minimized their contribution or made it secondary, such as helping men or ministry in a narrow sense that did not involve authority or preaching. References to deaconesses eventually disappeared from liturgical practice and came to be seen as anomalies outside the established order, or their functions were reduced to serving women so that male priests would not touch them, or to charitable work without any spiritual authority. As a result, the historical memory of women's significant influence and active role in the early centuries of Christianity was almost completely erased, replaced by an image of a submissive and secondary role, focused on family duties, piety, and humble service, but not on public preaching or spiritual power. This was part of the process of strengthening the male clergy and creating a church structure where power and authority were concentrated exclusively in the hands of men, in the image and likeness of the Roman imperial hierarchy. The goal was to establish a clear hierarchy in which women occupied a subordinate position, which was consistent with the social norms of the time and reinforced the power of the predominantly male ecclesiastical elite, while also preventing potential challenges to that power from within the community, or from heretical groups in which women often played a more prominent role. For example, in some Gnostic sects, this change not only affected religious practice, but also had a profound impact on the social status of women in society for many centuries, setting a precedent for their subordination, which was understood as part of the divine order and an essential feature of proper Christian society, sanctified by ecclesiastical authority. Returning to these lost pages of history through a critical study of the sources is important for a fuller understanding of the development of Christianity and the role that women actually played in its formation, as well as for contemporary debates about the role of women in the Church and society in general. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the onset of the period known as the Dark Ages, early Middle Ages, many of the colossal achievements of ancient science, philosophy, art, and culture were irretrievably lost or forgotten in Western Europe. This period was characterized not just by decline, but by the disintegration of centralized state structures, economic crisis, mass illiteracy, frequent wars, invasions of barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Huns, Vikings, Hungarians, and a massive outflow of population from cities to the countryside, which led to the destruction of urban life, the decline of trade, and the collapse of the once developed educational system. Literacy became a privilege of a minority, mainly the clergy. In these conditions, priorities shifted from intellectual development to basic survival, maintaining order and morality, where the leading role was played by the Church, which became the main custodian of at least some remnants of culture. It is important to note that in the East, in Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire that lasted for almost 1,000 years after the fall of the West, and in the Islamic world after the Arab conquests and the rise of the Caliphate, much of this knowledge was not only carefully preserved, but also actively developed. For example, in the famous libraries and academies of Alexandria, Constantinople, Byzantium, and then in the scientific centers of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, the Islamic world, the works of great ancient thinkers such as Aristotle, whose works on logic, ethics, metaphysics, and physics were fundamental to the development of Western thought, Plato, with his theory of ideas and political philosophy, Euclid, the founder of geometry, whose elements were translated and studied, Galen, an outstanding physician whose works formed the basis of medicine for 1,000 years, Ptolemy, the astronomer and geographer, whose geocentric model of the world was dominant but also included precise astronomical calculations, was carefully studied, copied, commented on, and translated into Arabic and Syriac. Arab scholars, in turn, did more than simply preserve the legacy. They actively added to it their own discoveries, making breakthroughs in algebra, development of the concept of zero, Arabic numerals, solving equations, algorithms, optics, studies of light and vision, creating the foundations of modern optics, astronomy, creation of observatories, refinement of star maps, development of new instruments, prediction of eclipses, chemistry, alchemy as a forerunner of chemistry, discovery of new substances, creation of distillation, and medicine, descriptions of diseases, development of new drugs, surgical methods, creation of the first hospitals and medical schools, such as in Baghdad and Cairo, forming the so-called Golden Age of Islamic science, which lasted for several centuries and was far ahead of the West during this period. In the West, the Church, which had become the dominant force and virtually the only major institution capable of supporting any intellectual activity, mainly through monasteries, which became rare centers of copying and learning, often viewed ancient knowledge, especially that which did not conform to Christian dogma, with deep suspicion and even open hostility. Many philosophical works, for example, the works of the Neoplatonists with their pantheistic ideas that could blur monotheism, the Stoics with their fatalism and atheistic tendencies, the Epicureans with their pursuit of pleasure. Scientific discoveries in astronomy, for example about the sphericity of the Earth and its movement around the Sun, which contradicted the literal interpretation of the Bible. Medicine, anatomy and surgery, which required dissection of bodies, which the Church often prohibited as desecration. Mathematics and physics, made by the ancient Greeks and Romans, were either abandoned or actively suppressed as pagan, unchristian, or heretical. Any knowledge that did not directly serve theology, did not help in interpreting the Bible, or did not support church dogma was considered useless, a distraction from the salvation of the soul, or even dangerous, capable of leading to heresy and error. For example, the heliocentric model of the world, proposed by Aristarchus of Samos long before Copernicus, which claimed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, was completely abandoned in favor of the geocentric system of Ptolemy, where the Earth is at the center of the universe, and all the celestial bodies revolve around it in complex orbits. The latter model, despite its obvious inaccuracies and the need for complex epicycles to explain the motion of the planets, was accepted by the Church as consistent with the Holy Scriptures, in which the Earth is often referred to as the motionless center of the universe and the center of creation, and common sense, which seemed obvious to man since he does not feel the Earth's movement. Its challenge later led to serious conflicts, as with Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake for heresy, including the ideas of multiple worlds and an infinite universe, and Galileo, tried by the Inquisition and recanting his views under threat of torture, in later centuries demonstrating how willing the Church was to defend the accepted scientific picture of the world, even when it contradicted new observations and evidence. Knowledge of Roman hygiene, complex systems of water pipes and sewers, public baths that contributed to the health of the population and the prevention of epidemics, ensuring the cleanliness of the cities, complex engineering structures, aqueducts, extensive road systems, bridges, multi-story buildings, domed structures, cement production, developed medicine based on empirical observations, surgery and the use of medicinal plants also declined. Cities shrank, sanitary conditions worsened, leading to frequent epidemics, such as the Great Plague that devastated Europe, and medical practice was often reduced to prayer, the use of herbs and folk remedies, rather than scientific methods, since the study of the human body, anatomy, and the treatment of diseases by surgery were considered sinful or unnecessary for the salvation of the soul, which was an absolute priority. The lack of systematic education and research meant that much medical knowledge was lost, and superstition and religious ritual often replaced rational approaches. This does not mean that the Church deliberately destroyed all knowledge by burning books, although this did happen, especially with regard to heretical or magical treatises. Rather, its priorities lay solely in the areas of theology and salvation of the soul, rather than empirical research and secular education. Monasteries, although they played a role as centers of cultural preservation and textual rewriting, mainly copied religious literature, the lives of saints, theological treatises, and the Bible, rather than scientific works, which were considered secondary or even dangerous. The emphasis on divine revelation as the source of truth, rather than on rational knowledge of the world through observation and experiment, led to stagnation in scientific development in the West for many centuries. The result was a slowdown in scientific progress for centuries and a significant loss of intellectual heritage, which was largely restored only during the Renaissance, thanks to increased contacts with the Islamic world, through the Crusades, trade links, and especially through translation centers in Spain, such as Toledo, where Arabic and Greek texts were translated into Latin and then disseminated throughout Europe, and Byzantium, from where many Greek texts were taken to the West after the fall of Constantinople and increased contacts with Byzantine scholars. It was through Arabic translations and commentaries that many ancient works returned to Western Europe, becoming the basis for a new flowering of science and philosophy that led to the epical scientific revolutions of the modern era. This period shows how the dominance of one ideology, even if it was not aimed at outright extermination, although there were cases of book burning and persecution of scientists, can lead to the neglect, oblivion, and even suppression of valuable knowledge if it does not fit into the established framework, or does not serve the immediate purposes set by the dominant structure. And the fifth was historical evidence contradicting the dogmas. Throughout its history, the Church, as a powerful and centralized institution, was faced with the constant need to defend its dogmas. Fundamental doctrinal truths that were considered immutable, divinely established, and not subject to doubt, and authority as the only and infallible source of truth and salvation. This struggle for control over truth, morality, and the conscience of the faithful often meant that any historical evidence, archaeological finds, or even oral traditions that might cast doubt on the official version of events contradicted the established teaching or undermined the authority of the church hierarchy were either ignored, fiercely criticized, or declared to be false, heretical, or the work of the devil. It was a constant and relentless struggle to preserve the purity of the faith and to assert its monopoly on the interpretation of truth and the mediation between God and man, since this was what gave the Church its unprecedented power. This included evidence that might undermine the moral character of church leaders, or portray the Church in an unfavorable light by revealing its human rather than divine shortcomings and weaknesses. Scandals involving corruption, such as simony, the practice of selling church offices and spiritual gifts that was widespread in the Middle Ages and caused indignation among believers and reformers. Nepotism, giving offices to relatives even if they were unworthy. Political intrigue within the church, struggles for the papal throne, assassinations of popes and anti-popes, influence over secular rulers, participation in wars, and the formation of political alliances to strengthen power and expand territorial influence, or clerical misconduct, violation of celibacy, accumulation of wealth, luxurious lifestyle, use of power for personal purposes rather than for service, were carefully concealed or minimized in official chronicles and historical records. Church historians have often omitted such facts, downplayed their significance, or rewritten them so that they did not tarnish the institution or spoil its immaculate image. For example, when it came to phenomena such as indulgences, the sale of absolution from sins, which reached incredible proportions in the late Middle Ages, becoming one of the key causes of the Reformation of the century and causing the wrath of Martin Luther, who considered it an insult to God and his teachings. The Crusades, which despite the religious slogans of liberating the Holy Sepulchre and fighting the infidels, were often accompanied by mass violence, looting, destruction of cultures, and the murder of both Muslims and Christians of other faiths, as was the case with the sack of Constantinople, which led to a schism between the Western and Eastern churches, or the activities of the Inquisition, a system of church courts created to combat heresy that used brutal torture and executions of heretics and witches, such as burning at the stake, which was sanctioned by the Church and supported by secular authorities. These pages of history, despite their unpleasantness and moral ambiguity, were nevertheless not completely erased, but their interpretation and presentation were often distorted to fit the official church line. They were presented as necessary measures to defend the faith, save souls, maintain order, or combat evil, even if this required significant distortion of facts and justification of cruelties that in the modern world are considered crimes against humanity. The goal was to maintain the unbroken image of the Church, its unchanging authority and sanctity, which was critical to maintaining control over the masses and the legitimacy of its power in the eyes of the faithful and secular rulers. Any information that might shake the faith of the flock or give rise to doubts about the divine origin and righteousness of the Church was undesirable and was subject to censorship, falsification. For example, the creation of forged documents, such as the donation of Constantine to justify papal authority, and its claims to secular dominion in the early Middle Ages, which was exposed as a fake, or destruction. This has meant that many aspects of church history and early Christianity remain the subject of intense scholarly debate and research, as historians have to sift through the layers of interpretations that have been built up over centuries to hide or rewrite inconvenient facts, using critical analysis of all available sources, including archival data, archaeological finds, and comparative study of different texts to reconstruct a more complete and objective picture of the past. These efforts to cleanse history show how power, whether religious or secular, always seeks to control the narrative. These 5 points are just a small part of a vast canvas where the Church, like any major historical force, has sought to control the narrative, shaping it to its advantage. Attempts to erase certain facts, ideas, or entire cultures from history are a complex and multifaceted process that is rarely a direct total destruction. More often, it occurs through a change in emphasis, rewriting, ignoring, marginalization, or even assimilation when elements of the old are incorporated into the new system but lose their original meaning. All these methods ultimately lead to the fact that broad layers of the population lose access to full and undistorted information, perceiving only a convenient version of the past. Studying these aspects allows us to better understand not only the history of the Church, but also the universal mechanisms of power, the formation of public consciousness, control over information, and the constant struggle for the interpretation of the past. Understanding these processes helps us to critically evaluate any information, to seek more complete and objective pictures of history, and to realize how the past can be used and manipulated to shape the present and even the future.